I'm Tim Christ. I'm president of the Newark History Society, and we're delighted that you're here and that Harold Holzer and Tom McCabe have been able to join us tonight. Before we get started, I want a couple thank yous. One to Bob Marasco, the Newark City Clerk, for arranging for the videotaping of tonight's program. As many of you know, Bob is also in charge of the city archives, and he's been responsible for some really positive developments in the city archives. They're coming together nicely under his leadership. I also want to thank Wilma Gray, sitting over there, the director of the Newark Public Library. Not only for hosting us tonight, but for providing such able leadership through difficult times for public libraries. Many of you probably saw the article in the Star Ledger over the weekend about the 100th anniversary of the dedication of Gustav Borglum's seated Lincoln statue over near the Essex County Courthouse. Guy Sterling, who's here in the front row, is giving a talk next Tuesday, June 7th, at the New Jersey Historical Society at 6 p.m. promptly, I understand, about the competition to create the statue and also the dedication ceremony. And then the next day, on June 8th, at 1:30 promptly, there will be a rededication ceremony, and I understand at the Essex County Courthouse at the seated Lincoln, and I understand that Governor Christie and former Governor Byrne and County Executive DiVincenzo will be there for that ceremony. Guy, I think you've been handing out flyers for this. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No,
So Guy has really done yeoman's work in pulling that series of events together. We're also pleased that he's on our executive committee for the Newark History Society. As most of you know, a group of us started the Newark History Society about a decade ago with the aim of encouraging research into Newark's almost 350 years of history and providing a forum for programs or events on different aspects of Newark's history. Next year, next spring, it's hard for me to believe, but we're going to be celebrating our 10th anniversary, and we're very pleased that Professor Kenneth Jackson of Columbia University and one-time head of the New York Historical Society has already agreed to speak at that event. Ken has been a really strong supporter of our activities from the very beginning and often comes to our events. So we'll get information out about that. Between now and then we'll have several other programs, including one in September on Newark in the mid-18th century. That was a time of land riots and Great Awakening revivals, and it was also the time when the college that became Princeton University was located on Broad Street. And that's why we're calling that program When Princeton Was in Newark, Aaron Burr Sr. and the College of New Jersey. After that one, we'll jump back to the 20th century with a program on high school sports in Newark, and if Warren Grover comes through, communists in Newark, and we hope Italians in Newark. There's this kind of Newark theme that runs through all of these. If you want to be on our email or mailing list, fill out one of these forms. They're on the table over there. Leave it on the table or give it to me, and we'll let you know about these future programs. I can also report that Gail Malmgreen, who is sitting in the second row here, and her colleagues are making really quite remarkable progress in the pilot phase of our Newark Archives project. The goal of that project, which we're doing in conjunction with Rutgers-Newark, is to develop an online finding aid for archival materials related to the history of Newark. Gail and her colleagues have already surveyed the New Jersey Historical Society. They're hard at work at the city archives. And I think some really interesting documents have been turning up. Gail was telling me the other day, and I hope I have this right, that the detailed records of Marcus Ward's personal monetary gifts to Civil War veterans in response to their requests turned up in this bundle wrapped in brown paper at the city archives. You'll recall that Marcus Ward was at the nominating convention in Chicago that nominated Lincoln, and he's the one who traveled down to Springfield and asked Abraham Lincoln to sit for the photograph that we put on our flyer. And his family gave the original of this photograph to the Newark Public Library, which we reproduced for this flyer. He was later governor of New Jersey and a member of Congress, and his papers, other papers, I guess, are at the New Jersey Historical Society. But on to tonight's program. We're very pleased to have Harold Holzer, one of America's most distinguished scholars of Abraham Lincoln, with us. Mr. Holzer is the chairman of the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation and the author or editor of some 40 books, far too many to list here. He was awarded the National Humanities Medal in 2008. His most recent major work on Lincoln was Lincoln, President-elect Abraham Lincoln in the Great Secession Winter of 1860 and 1861, and his remarks tonight will draw from that. He's also Senior Vice President for External Affairs at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and that resonates with us because a century ago, Henry Watson Kent, who was Secretary of the Met, and John Cotton Dana, who was the director of this library and started the museum down the street, were very close friends and formed common cause in ensuring that public institutions would indeed serve the public. And Henry Watson Kent was one of those who prepared an obituary of Dana after his death. But fortunately for us, Mr. Holzer is in that same tradition of deep commitment to in this case, public humanities, and has accepted our invitation to speak to us about the extraordinary challenges Abraham Lincoln faced 150 years ago during that great secession winter as the southern states were deciding whether to stay or to leave the Union, and as he prepared for his inauguration in March 1861. Before his inauguration, Lincoln made a long journey from his home in Springfield, Illinois, to Washington, D.C., if I've got this right, via Ohio, up to upstate New York, Buffalo, Rochester, eventually down to New York City, stopping, giving speeches along the way. Then he went through New Jersey, stopped in Newark, went on to Trenton, gave a speech in Trenton, on to Philadelphia, finally around Baltimore and into Washington. So during that trip, he did stop in Newark. He greeted the crowds here, and over time, a number of legends seem to have grown about that visit. And we asked Tom McCabe to take a fresh look at Lincoln's visit to Newark and try to determine what actually happened. In addition to being a member of our executive committee of the Newark History Society, Tom is a graduate of Princeton and Rutgers PhD and teaches the Newark History course down the street at Rutgers-Newark. So for tonight's program, we'll see how well this works. We've asked Mr. Holzer to start by sketching out the great challenges that Lincoln faced following his election in November 1860, and to get Lincoln on that journey, at least to New York, and then to pause for Tom to talk about Lincoln's visit to Newark, and then come back up and briefly review the issues confronting Lincoln in the early days of his presidency. And we hope to have a Q&A session at the end. So with that, Mr. Holzer.
Thank you for that very nice introduction and for naming a book title and awards and such. My head often used to turn from these introductions. I now have gotten my head screwed on right after Memorial Day. This was going to be a great joke. It's not good when it's interrupted, but I'll try it anyway. I'm determined to do this joke. Memorial Day, you remember it was hotter than today, humid, and I went to Riverside Park in New York City to the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It was built in honor of Civil War veterans, and there I was asked to give the keynote address on this stultifyingly hot day, and Mayor Bloomberg was one of the speakers, a couple of U.S. Army generals, and it went on and on and on, music and wreath laying. It was very moving. And after it was over, we had taken our 3.5-year-old grandson to the event, and when it was over, he was very well behaved too. He sat, my wife fanned him, but he was very good. We went up afterwards and said, "What was your favorite part of the event?" And he said, "The bagpipes." Okay. "What was the best part of the event?" He said, "Goodbye." "What was the worst part of the event?" He said, "Papa's speech." So no more, I won't take any of these introductions too seriously, because he gave me the review I needed to jolt me back into reality. It's really wonderful to be in Newark. I haven't been here for a long, long time. Maybe, I don't know, 30 years maybe. I used to come here every once in a while with a journalist. When I worked for Channel 13, you had a great television critic at the Star-Ledger named Jerry Krupnick. I don't know how many of you remember that name. And he and his wife Phyllis became friends of ours, and they used to take us here occasionally to the great Portuguese restaurants and taught us a whole new cuisine, and I miss him very much. I miss those days very much. Well, my role is clear. I'm going to bring Lincoln to Newark and then punt to my friend here, and then come back and assure you that he had a life after Newark, even if only a 4-year life. And put yourself in the position to begin that Abraham Lincoln was in after Election Day 1860. He's won 39% of the vote nationwide, just barely enough electoral votes to succeed. He hasn't gotten the vote from California yet, so it's less than 180 electoral votes pledged to him. And he is really the first president ever elected on a purely sectional basis. He is not given a single vote electorally south of the Mason-Dixon line. And though he has said, and had said when he was in New York at the Cooper Union occasion in February 1860, give us a chance, give Republicans a chance to compete on the ballot, and we will do very well. Well, not everybody, but some states gave him the chance. Missouri, he got 2% of the vote. Virginia, he got less than 2% of the vote. So in southern states, slaveholding states where he was on the ballot, he did miserably. And he now has to face the uncertainties of an interregnum, the likes of which we thankfully no longer suffer through. 4 months, not 2 months, as we have now, but 4 months, from November 6th to March 4th. And facing that uncertainty and the anger in the South, their refusal to accept the legitimacy of his victory, Abraham Lincoln decides on a very interesting approach. And it was the traditional approach. Think back to the Obama interregnum. He basically held a press conference every day. He stood at a podium like this, which had the seal of the office of the president-elect. That's a tradition that goes back a few presidents-elect. But believe me, there was no such tradition in 1860 and 61. Abraham Lincoln believed that he had no power to do anything but stir the pot further by speaking. And so he maintained a rigorous, some said stubborn silence, as the crisis that was precipitated by his election, whether fair or reasonable or not, just got worse and worse and worse. In December, South Carolina became the first of 7 states to announce that they were dissolving their ties to the Union as a direct result of Lincoln's election, arguing that his pledge only to, at that time, only to prevent any further extension of the institution of slavery, that is, to bar it from Western territories and new Western states, was sufficient for them to show that he was going to destroy the institution on which their economy was based. He was specifically not pledged to interfere with slavery in the states where it existed. It didn't matter. The southern states saw Lincoln as the prophet of doom for their way of life, and that was enough. But in this period, many moderates in the North, aware that his position was moderate, begged him to speak out. Remind Southerners, they said, that he really wasn't for an end to slavery. He wasn't an abolitionist. Lincoln wouldn't do it. Why wouldn't he do it? Well, he had several reasons. One was the tradition. Presidents-elect weren't seen and weren't heard. The other tradition was, don't open your mouth until the electoral votes are counted. You never know. And in this particular election, you really never know. You really didn't know. There was never a certainty that the electoral votes that were cast in December, that's another month, were going to be counted by law in Washington. And the tradition was, envelopes were sent to the vice president. In this case, it was John Breckinridge, a Southern Democrat who had run against Lincoln for the presidency. He would open them up and read them in Washington in February. What would happen between then and February? Would South Carolina's envelope count if they were gone? Would Mississippi's count if they were gone? What if the remaining Southern senators, like those from Virginia and North Carolina, what if they disrupted the proceeding? What if the fact that there were no senators from 7 states meant there was no quorum? Lincoln thought anything he might say could potentially exacerbate this very delicate situation. Now, he was called upon also to, as I said, to reassure Southerners that he was moderate. But Lincoln had another reason for not speaking out, and that was that he thought there was no honor and manhood, as he put it, in begging for the right to take the office to which he felt he had been legitimately elected. He wouldn't beg for the privileges of being president. He said, I'm elected, so I have nothing further to say. If people want to know about my position, read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, read the Cooper Union address, read the Republican platform. Other than that, I'm going to sit in my office in Springfield, Illinois, welcome visitors, pose for pictures, and that's about it. It's amazing, but he maintained that silence from November 6th to February 11th, the day before. I mean, there were little exceptions. He gave a speech to people outside his house when they were celebrating his victory, and he just said, I can't talk, basically, but thanks. I don't mean any harm to anybody. He wouldn't write letters except to say, I'm not going to say anything in the letters. What he did that I find interesting, and I devoted a lot of my book to, I'll just say this parenthetically and then continue the drama part here. While he was speaking not at all, others were. And Congress was entertaining compromises. A peace convention was gathering at the Willard Hotel in Washington to entertain compromises that would bind him in the future. And the compromises entailed, A, imposing a gag order back on Congress so they would never again discuss human slavery. B, extending slavery all the way to the Pacific and reviving the Missouri Compromise. And these Lincoln would not allow. But to articulate that disapproval would have gone against his vow not to speak at all. So what he did is he sent private letters to members of Congress, to senators, to say, hold fast as with a chain of steel. There is no compromise on the issue of slavery extension. And those remarkable letters actually held Congress back from giving away the store before he got there, for extending slavery. And if they had extended slavery, there would have been such a supermajority of pro-slavery senators and congressmen in Washington. Because, you know, in the ultimate hypocrisy, congressional seats were allocated not only based on voting population, but on slave population in the South. They got partial representation based on people who had no rights at all. Had Lincoln agreed to these compromises, slavery might have gone on in this country for another 50 years. So he did hold the line, even if he didn't speak. But Lincoln was a professional orator. I can see that, I can envision how frustrated he was at maintaining this silence for these 4 months. But on February 11th, the day before his 56th birthday, he gets on the train at last for the long journey that we heard described, beginning in his hometown. And after years of giving the most extraordinary speeches, extraordinary in length, you know, Lincoln was not the poet of simple, elegiac, short speeches up until this moment. He was part of the generation that rose to fame because he was able to provide a good 2-hour speech, a nice entertainment for people who didn't have television, the internet, or anything but church and politics, basically, and the annual county fair. Politics was entertainment. As he left Springfield, standing on the back of the train, overwhelmed with emotion, he spoke eloquently and briefly, talking about the task before him that he felt rested more heavily on him, and a burden that was heavier even than that which rested on George Washington. And those famous words, trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, I bid you an affectionate farewell. Poetry, unexpected poetry. And then he was off. When the actor Sam Waterston and I performed Lincoln's words, we've done it for 3 presidents and did it for the first President Bush in Houston. He said, this performance brought tears to my eyes, particularly one speech. And we said, which one? We thought the Gettysburg Address or the second inaugural. No, the farewell address. Why the farewell address? He said, because he said, here my children have been born and one lies buried. And no one knows what it's like to go off to assume the burdens of the presidency, leaving the grave of a child. And, you know, it's not the first thing you think about with President Bush, one, but his daughter had passed away and he left her grave in Houston to go to the presidency. It was very touching. That speech continues to touch people. Well, the morose aspect of the speech was soon vanished because the train, the special train that pulled out of Springfield, was just full of laughter and wine and music and celebration, and packed to the gills with telegraph operators and friends who were going off to see him off all the way to Indianapolis. And another aspect that we don't often think about, the most elaborate security that any president-elect had ever had as an escort en route to Washington, or even in Washington, I'd hazard to say. His gigantic, tough, longtime legal associate Ward Hill Layman was in charge, armed with pistols and brass knuckles. A young zouave drill master named Ephraim Elmer Ellsworth, who died just about 150 years ago this week, was with him, his law student from Springfield. Future Civil War generals like David Hunter and John Pope. A general named, my favorite, Edwin Vose Bullhead Sumner. He was named Bullhead because during the Mexican War, a bullet had hit him in the head and apparently bounced off without any damage to Sumner. That's a guy that you want to walk directly in front of you as you're traveling. Well, a lot of press as well, about 7 or 8 newspapers, wire services. They're the ones who made Lincoln rewrite that farewell address because he said it extemporaneously and then rewrote it on the train, even better than the way it had been recorded back in Springfield. So he goes off with the press, with the bodyguards, with his children, at least, I'm sorry, his son. His wife was not permitted to go on with his youngest children because no one knew whether the train would be blown up. And he wanted his wife to be safe, so she would join him on a later train. They went off to Indianapolis. the first big stop, Lincoln made a speech from the balcony of the hotel, and was not brilliantly received, I must say. He continued to talk about having a task before him greater than that which faced Washington. But even with a great reception, thousands and thousands of people marching with him all the way to his hotel, he said, would the marching of an army into South Carolina without the consent of her people really be invasion? In their view, the Union is only a family relation. It's not like a regular marriage of all, but it's sort of a free love arrangement to be maintained on what that sect, and that was considered a radical sect, free love sect, calls passionate attraction. These are all terms from the political dialogue of the day, but people in the audience must have thought, what on earth is he talking about? I mean, is he really as undignified as we've heard his enemies say? He's talking about free love and marriage and, well, anyway. He got in trouble for that first speech, and he was in a bad mood when he got to the supper in his honor. So one point, and there are great newspaper reports, waiters spilling food on the guests and unable to serve, and the food is cold. Sounds like one of the dinners we might complain about today. At one point, he turned to his son Robert and said, I think I'll go upstairs now and work on my inaugural address. He had entrusted the package to Robert. So he said to Robert, where is the manuscript? And Robert, 16 years old, who had had more than his share of bubbly wine on the trip and was trying to impress the Indiana girls at the time, said, I don't know. Lincoln berated Robert in front of all of the people there. Robert shrugged it off. Lincoln raced downstairs. The dining room was on the second floor, raced downstairs to the first floor, vaulted over the registration desk, and you can imagine with those long legs, and began looking through black oilskin grip sacks, and they all looked pretty much alike. And there's great reports that he found a bunch of paper collars that someone was wearing, liquor, all sorts of things. Finally found the inaugural address, and remember, he hadn't saved it onto his hard drive or his floppy disk. This was it. This was his copy of the inaugural address, and he was changing it. And he sort of threw it into his son's stomach like a football pass and said, now hold on to it. So not a great first night for Lincoln, but he then began asking people about the address, and one of the motifs of this journey is as Lincoln is giving rather lighthearted remarks for the rest of the journey, he's also working very hard on this speech, which he continues to do all the way to March 4th, actually progressively taking a bellicose speech and toning it down, grade by grade by grade, until it was a rather pacific speech aimed at reminding the South, as his silence had reminded the South, that he meant no threat to him. Well, he goes on, as we've heard, through Ohio. In Columbus, Ohio, on February 13th, at the State House, that still stands and is still used for the state government, he actually gets the telegram that says he has won the electoral vote officially. Not until that minute did he actually know that this trip was not just an excursion, that he had a reason to go to Washington. And there are reports of him stuffing it into his pocket and clapping his hands together in a rare display of emotion, aside from yelling at his son, and saying, Governor, you have a beautiful new state capital, let's go back inside. And that was his reaction to his victory, final, true victory. Well, he continues the journey and gives really nothing more than greetings for much of the rest of the way at small towns. He gives major speeches in other cities, Columbus, Buffalo, Albany, New York City. But mostly it's, I want to see you and you want to see me, and because of the way I look, you have the best of the bargain, or I'd like you to meet my wife, this is what we call the long and the short of it, things like that. These speeches are all reprinted in the national press, and there are people who don't think that these speeches are fitting for the drama and the anxiety of the occasion either. In fact, one critic writes that he's an embarrassment and that he's not fit to hold the presidency, and that his speeches are appalling. And it's interesting that the person who wrote those remarks would later concede, after giving a 2-hour oration at Gettysburg on November 19th, 2 years later, that Lincoln had come nearer to the central idea of the occasion in 2 minutes than he had. And that orator who had complained about Lincoln and took a while to understand the greatness and the simplicity of his communication skills was Edward Everett, the man who later gave the principal oration at Gettysburg, and of whom Lincoln once wickedly said, he's been famous for so long that nobody really remembers why he was famous in the first place. You know, keep in mind also that while all these things are going on, secession, criticism, not uncertainty about the Electoral College, Lincoln is also trying to form a cabinet. He hasn't done that yet, trying to attract moderate Southerners, former Whigs, to join his cabinet unsuccessfully, trying to convince William Seward to join Salmon Chase. They hated each other, still unsuccessfully. And for the first and only time in history, there's a parallel inaugural journey going on. Jefferson Davis is going from Mississippi to Alabama for his inauguration, getting rave reviews, attracting big crowds, giving lots of speeches. Consider what that was like. Well, Lincoln continues, gets to my state, New York. He gets such a great welcome in Buffalo that one of the bodyguards' arms is dislocated in the crowd. Let's see if you can top that in Newark. That's a pretty enthusiastic, warm embrace. He gets to the little town of Westfield, New York, upstate, and there he meets a little girl named Grace Biddell. Does anybody know who she is? Yes. The little girl who told him to grow, wrote to him and suggested he grow a beard, and to whom he wrote a famous letter saying that would be silly to do that now. Well, when he got to Westfield, he said, is there a little girl here named Miss Barley? He got the first letter right, because she asked me to grow a beard, and you could see, acting partly upon her suggestion, I have done so. If she's here, I would love her to step forward. And they pushed her forward, and he gave her kisses. He kissed her, and she sort of bristled back because of his beard. And this is clearly a day not like the 21st century. You could kiss little girls in public and have nobody think anything of it. And Grace Biddell was so embarrassed that she ran home and hid under her family's carriage. She couldn't be found for hours. She was so embarrassed at all the fuss. And when they finally coaxed her out, she told that story for the next 75 years. She lived off the story. She became a lecturer. She was alive until 1934 or so. So it was 40, 70, almost 75 years. Then it goes on to Albany. I think Lincoln's rhetoric actually, and it's significant, changed markedly when he got to the states that were part of the original 13 colonies. Something affected him. It was just not going through the homes of his western neighbors anymore. In Albany, he talked about New York. In Princeton, in Trenton, he talked about the book he had read long ago, the book about George Washington by Parson Weems, that gave him the idea that the Revolutionary War was not just about battles, it was about ideas. It was about the idea that any one of our children can rise, as my father's son has, to the presidency of the United States. A whole different kind of speech. But I don't want to get ahead of the game, because he gets first to probably the unfriendliest welcome of his entire journey, my city, New York City, unfortunately. He gets into town, and it's a Democratic town. He's gotten about 30% of the vote here. And there are reports from Democratic newspapers that though people are lining the street, it's utter silence most of the way. Walt Whitman is caught in the traffic jam. He's on a bus, on one of those open omnibuses, and writes that he thought the silence was actually threatening. Who knows if someone held a knife nearby, he said. There were no cheers, no shouts of welcome. And the next day, Lincoln went to City Hall, ostensibly for a reception, and there the mayor of New York, Fernando Wood, calmly told him that he was thinking of having New York City secede from the Union and become a free city so it could maintain its profitable relationships with the slave states in the South. Lincoln was not in a great mood in New York. He got an invitation to Barnum's Museum, but he was a little bit morose and stayed in his hotel instead. He met some wealthy Republicans. He did what he had to do, but he said, "I understand," he said to the mayor, "a ship to be made for the carrying and preservation of the cargo. And so long as the ship can be saved with the cargo, it should never be abandoned." And with those less than brilliant words, but clearly anxious words, he left New York, hit the Hudson, and came to New Jersey. And with that, I will punt to Tom McCabe to tell you about his visit to Newark. Thank you.
It's all about the shoes. Shoes may well make the man, but in the case of Newark, it could be argued that shoes also made the city. Starting in 1790, when Moses Coombs, a Market Street shoemaker, sold 200 pairs of leather shoes to a Savannah, Georgia gentleman, Newark was on its way to becoming a great manufacturing and industrial center. It also marked the beginning of a long and profitable trading partnership with the American South. Throughout the antebellum period, Newark was a virtual Southern workshop, providing nearly 65% of its products, from shoes and clothing to saddles and carriages, to Southern markets. Our beloved Newark historian Charles Cummings once said that Newark made everything from A to Z, asbestos to zippers, and most of it was shipped below the Mason-Dixon line. This would all be jeopardized if Abraham Lincoln was elected as the first Republican president in the fall of 1860. It was altogether ironic then that a Newark-based shoe company, the famed Johnson & Murphy firm, made shoes for Abraham Lincoln, as they have for every president since 1850. As the tallest president in U.S. history at 6'4", Johnson & Murphy had to make the new president size 14 shoes. Before the president-elect ever set foot in Newark, though, the city was alive with politicking, infighting, and intrigue. Most Newarkers were interested in matters of union and disunion, slavery and freedom, but they were more worried about their livelihoods. So as early as the summer of 1860, Newark citizens tried to make sense of the various parties and their platforms. The summer before the election, one newspaper tried to simplify the matter and carried an article under the following headline: "The Four Parties and How They Differ." On the issue of slavery, the Newark Daily Advertiser observed, "The Lincolnites see a great advancing evil and face it boldly to combat it. The Breckinridgeites see it and offer to give it welcome. The Douglasites see it and propose to look on it with calm indifference. And the Bell Everites shut their eyes to it so as not to see it at all." Anti-Lincoln, anti-war sentiment in the Newark Journal warned of the severe economic effects of the war and what it could have on Newark. Quote, "Should Lincoln be elected, many of our largest factories will be compelled in self-defense to make still less work, and many mechanics and journeymen will be compelled to face the rigors of winter and meet the terrible answer everywhere: no work, no work." It asked the question, are you prepared to vote for that party which will be the instrument of taking the bread from the mouths of your wives and children? Newark, always a town for parades, bristled with excitement in the weeks before the November election. Republican wide awakes and Democratic copperheads both marched in partisan gatherings, and listened with rapt attention to local politicians stumping for their candidates. On October 31st, 5,000 Lincoln supporters gathered at James Street, a block or so from where we're gathered tonight, before marching through the streets in a torch-lit procession. The following night, over 5,000 anti-Republican marchers, backed by bands and a drum corps, snaked through the city's streets. Fireworks lit up the skies, and as one commentator reported, Republicanism was, it seemed, doomed to defeat. Some people held signs aloft. One read, "For President, anybody but a black Republican." Another, "Shall we peril the liberty of 27 million whites to make 4 million slaves worse off?" Finally, a float passed by, one borrowed from New York, and according to the moderate Daily Advertiser, it depicted, quote, "a party of Negroes and white girls in a boat steered by Horace Greeley with Lincoln at the prow. The girls sat on the Negroes' laps in vulgar embrace, and Uncle Sam prevented them from landing." The float bore the motto, "No Negro Equality." The atmosphere on Election Day in Newark was electric, and there was isolated street fighting in the city's 6th Ward, where a strong police force had to guard the polls. Once the votes were counted, it was apparent that Lincoln suffered a heavy defeat in Newark. He carried only 2 of the 12 wards. New Jersey did not vote for Lincoln either, and she was the only northern state not to do so. A month and a half after the election, and a month before Lincoln would visit Newark, South Carolina left the Union. 6 others followed. And there was even some sentiment that New Jersey should secede as well. Many in Newark agreed, especially since its businesses suffered in the wake of Lincoln's election. Yet after Lincoln won the election, New Jersey's governor invited the president-elect to speak in Trenton while on his way to the inauguration. Lincoln agreed to the governor's request and sent him a letter with a postscript. It read, "Please arrange no ceremonies that will waste time." A Newark delegation visited New York City's Astor Hotel on February 19th, 2 days before his visit, and urged him to spend some time, however short, in the state's great metropolis. Lincoln listened to Judge Cleaver of Newark's Common Council and agreed to visit, before asking him to make arrangements with his assistant. After the Newark delegation left the Astor Hotel, Lincoln penned another brief note to remind them of his wishes. "I shall be able to do no more than bow to the people of Newark from the train." It was signed A. Lincoln. The agreed-upon route appeared in the morning's paper the day before his actual visit, and it indicated that Lincoln's party was to pass through the city from the Morris and Essex station to the Chestnut Street station, over a mile and a half away by way of Broad Street. The route was announced in the papers, and Newarkers seemed proud to show off our broad and magnificent avenue that bears witness to the fruits of manufacturing skill and enterprise and steady devotion to the principle of free labor. Hurried arrangements were made, and some of the military show and pomp and circumstance was passed over for want of time and to honor Mr. Lincoln's wishes. After an early morning ferry ride from Manhattan, the president-elect first set foot on Jersey soil in Jersey City. He gave a speech to thousands gathered at the train depot before boarding his special train, the four-car William Pennington, and it started to snow as he made his way across the Jersey meadows. Boys perched on telegraph poles and the roofs of buildings heralded the train's approach, and the weather didn't seem to impede Mr. Lincoln's tight schedule as the presidential train arrived on time, pulling into the station near the present Broad Street station at 9:30 in the morning. Despite Lincoln's request that there be no speeches, introductions, or handshaking, Mayor Moses Bigelow welcomed him to the city and said that Newark citizens have ever been loyal to the Constitution and maintain the integrity of the Union, and entertain an ardent hope that your administration will be governed by that wisdom and by that discretion with which be the means of transmitting the Confederate States as a unit to your successors. Mr. Lincoln listened attentively and then spoke. He said, "Mr. Mayor, I thank you for this kind reception to your city, and would say in response that my heart is sincerely devoted to the work you deserve I should do. With my ability, I cannot hope to succeed, but I trust to be sustained by divine providence and this great, free, happy, and intelligent people. Without this, I cannot hope to succeed. With it, I cannot fail. I thank you again for this kind reception." Lincoln bowed to the audience and then proceeded to fold his 6'4" frame into the waiting horse carriage. Hitched to a white carriage were 4 gray horses, and the president-elect was joined by the mayor, Judge Cleaver, and General Jonathan Dayton. 19 other carriages joined in the procession down Broad Street. Since the early morning, the city streets were almost impassable, and Newarkers and Jerseyans from a nearby 100 little villages jostled to get a glimpse of Honest Abe. Spectators lined Broad Street, stuffed themselves onto balconies and terraces, and peered out of every available window. Some climbed trees to get a better look. Encouraging shouts were heard, some of which Mr. Lincoln acknowledged, but his face was deep set, observed the historian David Lawrence Pearson. He was meditating, no doubt, upon the strenuous experiences in store for him in the nation's awful drama. Mr. Lincoln first entered into conversation with the others in his carriage at Military Park, and he turned to the mayor and commented on the park's beautiful elm trees. He also commented on the enthusiasm along the widest street in America. According to the embedded New York Times reporter, quote, "Very many private carriages stood along the line, all of which were filled with bright-eyed ladies who smiled and waved with as much enthusiasm, if not as much noise, as the ruder specimens of humanity who surged by them on foot. We have never seen a more extensive or prettier display of lovely women than was made on the main street of Newark during the passage of the procession." Mr. Lincoln was struck by it and thought if there were as many brave men as there are fair women in the city, Newark would indeed be a difficult city to take. According to the Newark newspaper, it seemed as though the entire population of half the state had gone wild with enthusiasm and delight. The people ran, shouted, hurrahed, and waved hats and handkerchiefs to an astonishing degree. The roofs of stores, dwellings, factories, and sheds were covered with nearly as many spectators as in the streets. Another observed, men and women and children were temporarily insane. Women scattered flowers and blew kisses at the new president as they stood in their fancy carriages. One child, 9-year-old Washington Court, was the son of English parents, and he trailed behind the president's carriage, slipping and sliding in the snow. Washington's father was one of the first Newarkers to join the newly formed Republican Party in 1856. He recalled years later, "Mr. Haynes dismissed the school so he could see old Abe Lincoln pass through Newark. I stood at Broad and Hill Streets in front of the Sanford's Hotel and saw him go by, and then followed his carriage to the Chestnut Street station, where he boarded a train for Washington. This was the most thrilling experience of my life." When the war started, Washington left school and began working with his father. He made bayonet scabbards for the Army, as well as cap boxes, knapsacks, cartridge boxes, saddlebags, and other leather goods for the cause. Another child remembered the day of lowering clouds and light snow falling when Honest Abe rode down Broad Street. Several of us stood at Market and Broad. As his carriage approached, we made a grand charge through the snow and slush to the side of his vehicle. When the driver slowed up and Abe put out his hand, which we grabbed, giving it a cordial shake, even this late day, I see his benign look through the pair of eyes that spoke volumes. He was on his way to hear the dreadful burden of 4 years' bloody conflict. Old Abe encountered more children at the 9th Ward Public School just around the corner from the station. They stood, smartly dressed, on 3 platforms, and as he passed by, they sang, "Hail Columbia." The president stood up, acknowledged them, and bowed 3 times. The procession slowed just before South Park, the very park that would be renamed Lincoln Park in 1869. He did not speak there, but made an immediate left onto Chestnut Street. The procession grinded to a halt in front of the depot, where a huge crowd hemmed the presidential carriages in, and a terrible struggle occurred. Newark police pushed the crowd back. With the help of the police lieutenant, Mr. Lincoln boarded the train. In the ensuing crush, one man was knocked senseless and suffered a broken collarbone, and a young woman was run over by a wagon, but did not appear to suffer any injuries. Guess the tough Newarker might trump yours. From the back of the train, the president-elect thanked the enthusiastic turnout once again. In less than an hour after he arrived, to the strain of the Star-Spangled Banner, he was headed south to Trenton. The Newark Daily Advertiser sought to compare the president's political future to the weather. The weather, too, was suggestive of Mr. Lincoln's political progress, the paper said. The day opened with a bright, sunny sky, soon after obscured by frigid snow squalls, and finally terminating in a clear, invigorating atmosphere. Newark, and perhaps the nation, seemed to be all four seasons in one day.
What a great talk. With all due respect to Johnston and Murphy, that's Johnston and Murphy, right? I don't think the shoes fit very well, because Lincoln soon entertained the services of a chiropodist named Dr. Issachar Zachary, who's now known in history as Lincoln's Jewish doctor. And Dr. Zachary cast a mold of his feet and did a sketch of his feet. A friend of mine actually owns the sketch. It's amazing. Lincoln actually traced his own feet and made made-to-order boots that apparently, as he put it, gave him great relief, while the press made fun of him. We've been worrying about the head of the nation for so long. Obviously, we should have been worried about the feet of the nation, that kind of thing. But I didn't know the Johnson and Murphy story. That's even if it was a temporary fix, it's a great story. So we'll just proceed down to Trenton, and I told you when he went to the State House, he talked about American exceptionalism, civil religion, George Washington, and he did something, and let's assume he was wearing his Johnson and Murphy boots. Lincoln said, if the southern states continue their behavior, we may have to bring down our foot a little bit. And with that, he took that gigantic size 14 shoe and slammed it down, and everyone was sort of shocked and riveted by it. But it was a turning point. It was a point that Lincoln used his Johnson and Murphy boots to say, I'm drawing a line in the sand, not to torture the metaphor here, and we're not going to let them cross it. We're not extending slavery to compromise with the southern states, and it is going to be what it's going to be, nor are we going to tolerate the breaking up of this marriage that he had talked about infelicitously in Indianapolis. He proceeded next to Philadelphia, and there got some bad news. Alan Pinkerton, the detective, who was then a railroad employee, came up to see him and told him, with others in the room, that an assassination plot awaited him in Baltimore, hostile Baltimore. He'd been told a little bit about it, I believe, in New York. He was told the same story a few hours later by future Secretary of State Seward's son, Frederick Seward. The stories matched. He felt that it was credible enough that he would take measures necessary to save his own life. First, though, and it was all about crossing from one train station to another. As Tom told you, he did that in Newark as well. In those days, the trains would come from the south and stop, and you'd have to go across town to get a train that went farther south. They weren't contiguous. There was no Amtrak. Maybe that was better, I don't know, but there was no Amtrak. And there was danger in those crossings. If you were in the train, you had your own security. Once you got in those open carriages, you were open. So Lincoln said, look, I'm still going to raise the flag in front of Independence Hall on Washington's birthday. And he did. And he said, very famously, I would rather be assassinated on this spot than to surrender it. People think it was this portentous look to 1865, but it wasn't. It was a recognition that danger awaited him in Baltimore. He then went to Harrisburg, keep an appointment there with the new governor of Pennsylvania, and then left a reception. Nobody knew he had left except a few people, and just with Ward Lamon and Pinkerton, went back to Philadelphia, took a night train to Baltimore, and then a dawn train across to Washington. His train was pulled through the streets by horses on tracks, on trolley tracks. They say, or his enemies said, that he wore a disguise to avoid recognition, a Scottish cap and a military cloak, which he denied, but recognized that perhaps it was not a wise choice to have gone in secrecy through Baltimore. But he really believed that his life might have ended there. And there's some new research that indicates that it was definitely a credible threat and a dangerous one. We all know what happened next, inauguration, war, and that's another 3 hours of dialogue. But I wanted to leave you, now that you've been so patient with both of us as we've gone through this journey from Springfield east and then south, from Albany through New York City, Newark, and on into Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Washington. I just want to tell you about one person who was on the entire trip with him up until Harrisburg. And even if you read all the newspaper accounts and all the manifests of the trip that were widely published and filled with the names of these bodyguards and these newspaper men and Lincoln's family and his brother-in-law who was his personal physician and all of these people, this name appears in none of them. His name was William Johnson. And his name was not published for the simple reason that he was a person of color. He was Lincoln's valet. And he was there to be what we now call a body person. President Obama's body person is practically a celebrity in his own right. He's a rock star. Everybody writes about him. He was the one who attended to Lincoln's needs, helped him dress in the morning, made sure he had the papers he needed, just like a modern presidential body person, known as a valet. No one mentioned his name on the entire journey. When they got to Washington, Abraham Lincoln decided to reward William Johnson with a job as a servant in the White House. Not a great reward, but that was the reward. Well, the Irish servants in the White House said, no way. We're not going to have a black person working in the White House as a servant. That was not allowed. So Lincoln tried to get William Johnson a job as an employee of the Naval Department and wrote a letter to the Navy Secretary saying, will you employ, and he said this, it's going to sound racist, but think of the day, think of the age, and I'm going to be honest about it. Please help my boy Johnson. He is a good and honest boy. I don't know how old he was, frankly. He was a man, but that's how Lincoln referred to him. But he was still trying to get him employment. The Navy, which was the only integrated branch of the service and had been for generations, would not take him on. Finally, Lincoln got William Johnson a job as a gardener in the White House. And after a year and a half, he finally was able to get Johnson back into service in the building and resume his work as the valet to the President of the United States. It doesn't seem like much, but let me tell you the coda to the story. Lincoln took another famous train trip in November 1863 to Gettysburg. Johnson's name wasn't listed on that manifest either, but he went with him. On the way back on November 19th, Lincoln felt a terrible headache coming on and had to lie down in the train. Johnson got him a wet cloth and put it on his head. He had come down with smallpox, caught from his son. Had the Gettysburg Address been November 20th instead of November 19th, Lincoln never would have been able to do it. He was seriously ill. He liked it because he got to rest for the only week vacation he ever had in the White House. In fact, he said if there are any office seeker, he's got a terrible rash, and he say if there are any office seekers in the White House, have them come into the bedroom because now I have something I can give to everybody. Johnson is the man who nursed Lincoln night and day. And we don't hear very much except in December. There's a little item in the Washington Chronicle that says, William Johnson, President Lincoln's man, died today of smallpox. I have no doubt that he caught smallpox from Lincoln. Lincoln's constitution was remarkable. He was tough as nails. Not everybody else was. Abraham Lincoln had him buried in a cemetery, a newly created cemetery that was a real stick-it-to-you cemetery because it was on the grounds of Robert E. Lee's wife's plantation, where slave labor had worked the fields only a few years before. And of course, it's Arlington, which is now the National Soldiers Cemetery. Lincoln had William Johnson buried there, and I know this is not going to sound like a big deal, but Abraham Lincoln never bought a headstone for his own father. His stepmother made him promise he would. He never did. Didn't like his father. But he liked William Johnson well enough to buy a headstone. And it's still there today. If you ever go to Arlington, go to the office and ask to see the grave of William Johnson. Because there is the original inscription written by Abraham Lincoln, and it says, William Johnson, citizen. Because by then, with African Americans fighting for their own freedom in the armed services, the world had changed. And Abraham Lincoln, after 2 train journeys and a wealth of experience, had changed too. Thank you.
Well, those are both splendid talks, and both Tom and Harold have agreed to answer questions if there are some. And the floor is open. We'll do this for a few minutes. Gail?
I'd just like to ask Tom McCabe how you account for the amazing change between the time of the election and the time of the visit in the atmosphere.
I think Newark put on its best face, and when President-elect comes through, you want to show off your city. In 1860, there was opposition. His visit, there's welcome and acceptance and even enthusiasm, according to the reports. And it was really kind of unexpected based on what Newark was up to. There's an effigy hanged or hung off of a lamppost along Broad Street. And there's conflicting newspaper reports. Was it Lincoln because it had whiskers? Was it an abolitionist? Was it a secessionist? Different papers say different things. So there's some of that protest along the way. 1861, after Fort Sumter, there's support in the city for Lincoln and his cause. But by 1862, with the multiplying losses, both of men and battles, Newark starts to turn again. And then in July of 1863, a mob attacks a post office, throws some rocks through the windows. Nothing as severe as the draft riots across the river in New York City in July. And then there was general opposition to the Emancipation Proclamation in the town as well. So it's an anomaly, I think, that the newspaper reports, an embedded New York Times reporter, plus the local Newarkers and the papers are commenting on the 25,000+ people in attendance and cheering and welcoming the president-elect.
Well, I wonder if there might not have been more, but it certainly seems as though the perception of the guy that emboldened him for his kind of speech and his stamping of his foot. And when I initially heard both of you describing sentiments opposing the Republicans, it made me wonder, well, how on earth did they win the popular support? Why did anyone vote for the Republican platform and Lincoln? So I think it really points to some other elements of the kind of character that Lincoln represented, his own story, the popularity of the cause, to the general sympathy, the anti-slavery sympathy that people felt. I just wonder what else you might have to say about that.
You know, it's a complicated story, and it's always dangerous to judge by receptions. Lincoln came from a raucous political tradition where people yelled out their opposition during speeches, but in the end, I think Tom is right. When the president-elect comes, you put on a show of respect. And 25,000 people is a great crowd, but there were a lot more people in New Jersey who didn't like Lincoln, and they probably stayed home. So it's not an exact measurement of popularity. I happen to believe that Whitman's description of the silence that greeted Lincoln is probably a bit of an exaggeration. It's dramatic, but it was written in the 1880s when Whitman was contemplating looking back at the assassination and other things. And with all due respect to New Jersey, it was a Democratic state. Don't forget that in 1864, New Jersey voted for George B. McClellan, later elected this very strange gentleman as your governor. We won't get into that. I won't hold that against you. But New York City elected McClellan's son as its mayor. So, you know, there was deep roots. So I'm not sure that it was that, and I think this is another important aspect to your, in responding to your question. It's a complicated question. I don't think emancipation was an easy sell in any northern state. Today, Lincoln is routinely criticized for not doing it sooner, for not extending it to loyal southern slaveholding states immediately. But I think he took an enormous political risk with states like New Jersey and New York, certainly Maryland and Delaware and the other border states. He was not popular during this period. And in 1862, he suffered an off-year election loss that was almost as bad as the one that President Obama suffered. And that's without the South voting. So these were tough times.
I would just add, I found a report about an Irish immigrant, and when the president passes by, he says, ensure he's the plainest dressed man in the party. And the newspaper goes on to talk about how people felt that Mr. Lincoln was one of their own, you know, rising from the bottom of society and up. So it helped him win a bit of the public heart, maybe just on that day.
And you did the Irish immigrant because I did the Jewish doctor, right?
Yes.
Okay. We're even.
Bob Russo, former Newark resident, kid is 12, growing up in Newark, seeing President Kennedy here. As you talk, I couldn't help but think of my own experience having President Kennedy come. And you know, President Kennedy, to many of us, was sort of the second Lincoln, the same division, civil rights, whatever. But is there any parallel there? Did you see any parallel? We saw it in downtown Newark in the Moss Theater, which was called the time, thousands of people cheering President Kennedy. It reminds me of what you just told us about Lincoln. But I was a 12-year-old living in Newark at the time. I could relate to that, and that made me feel the vividness of what you told us about Lincoln.
Yeah, the accounts of the two kids, the 9-year-old and I think the 11-year-old, really spoke to me as I was going through the sources. And yeah, I mean, they call the Civil Rights era or the long Black Freedom Movement the Second Civil War, and you know, there is this parallel between you know, Kennedy and Lincoln, almost 100 years apart. So I think you can make those connections. I mean, obviously you're tapping into, you know, that childhood experience that you had, just like Washington Court and F.E. Dennis did in 1860. And they never forgot it. It was one of the great days of their lives.
I'm feeling like those kids.
Yeah.
Want to speculate on something?
Sure.
You think that Lincoln would be today as revered as he is, had he lived at the time of Reconstruction? Would we be talking about him as the number one president of our system?
Did you all hear the question? Yes. You know, it's hard to know. It's, again, counterfactual history is very tempting and fun. I like to think, and I have no basis for this thought except that I believe that Lincoln was a very astute politician, and that he knew how to walk slowly and steadily toward a goal. As he put it, back to the shoes and the feet. He said, when I take a long time to lift up my foot and put it down, but once I move forward, I don't go back. And I just feel that this man who spoke 3 days before his assassination, in what would be his last speech, about extending the right to vote to people of color who had fought in the ranks, or the very intelligent, as he put it, again, it sounds like a means test today, but in that day, it was enough for John Wilkes Booth to say that means Negro equality. He was in the crowd, and he didn't use the word Negro, as you can imagine. 3 days later, he killed him. Yes, instantly creating a martyr and a national saint who, in the bargain, died on Easter and Passover weekend, so there was a lot of religiosity and church and synagogue mourning attending him. But I do think that he would have managed it better. I think they would not have been instant gains the way they were and then taken away, replaced by black codes and the Klan. I think it might have been slower, but it might have been surer. And I say often, although again, it's my own bias as a Lincoln admirer coming out, that if Lincoln had been there to manage the crises of the 1860s, there might not have been a need for the second revolution of the 1960s. But I don't know. I got to see Kennedy at Idlewild Airport when I was 11, and I never forgot it either. I saw Lyndon Johnson too, but I forgot that. It's interesting, the difference. Is anybody? Okay, you sir.
You said that Lincoln only got 39% of the vote. What I was curious about was that the highest amount? How many people ran for the president?
4.
4. He got the highest.
He got the highest amount. Douglas got the second highest by winning states like New Jersey, but he only got something like 39 electoral votes. Well, Lincoln was the wide winner electorally because he won all of the North except New Jersey.
And second quick question that in reading history books, American history books, I never could understand. When Lincoln was president, became president, and he South succeeding and so forth, what kind of army did he have at his disposal when this was starting to go on? It always sounds to me like, he had just a few troops.
We didn't have a professional army or a standing army. In fact, this country believed until the post-Vietnam era, really, that you're not supposed to have a standing army. It's counter to what the founding fathers believed in. On the day after Fort Sumter was attacked, Lincoln issued the first call for 75,000 volunteers. And it was overnight, practically, that regiments were raised in New Jersey and New York and Massachusetts, and had to then march through Baltimore to face the same dangers that Lincoln faced. They were attacked in Baltimore. Massachusetts troops were attacked, adding credence to the Lincoln getting out of town's decision. But no, we didn't have a standing army, and we had another parallel is Pearl Harbor. We had a very old fleet of ships, wooden ships, and a lot of them were destroyed at Hampton Roads before the Monitor and Merrimack faced off against the
These are the two questions about place names. Given the declining support for Lincoln in Newark during the early years of the war, when was the name of South Park changed to Lincoln Park, and what was the council debate on that name change? And the second name has to do with Beecher Street, right behind the South Park Presbyterian Church. Was Beecher the reverend at that church or at the First Presbyterian Church? And how did that street bear his name? Because he was associated with the abolitionist movement.
The Beecher street name, I'm not aware of, but I know right upstairs in the New Jersey room, they have a file on street names, what they were and what they get changed to. So I'll check that and get a response. On the debate of Lincoln's roots, there has been some debate between Charles Cummings, God rest his soul, and Clement Price, leading New Jersey historian, Newark historian. And I have in my file a letter written from D.C. That person who sent the letter was mistaken. Charles Cummings was in the right. All the evidence in the newspapers and the early secondary sources suggest that he made that left. I believe that Lincoln, as a great president, will not trump Washington, right? So Washington Park stays Washington Park. The next park along this route is Military Park. You are not going to rename Military Park, old and sacred ground in Newark. The next park, the one that he would have been able to see off to his right, is South Park. And that gets renamed Lincoln Park in 1869. Also an interesting time, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War during Reconstruction, to rename that.
And Tom, am I correct in saying that there were a lot of people in Newark that did not think that the South Common should become Lincoln Park?
I did not. I read a brief history of Lincoln Park and did not see anything, but that was, kind of...
In Tuttle's book, How Newark Became Newark,
yes,
he talked about the opposition to changing the name to Lincoln Park.
Yeah.
And some of that,
I think Tuttle's characterization of antebellum Newark during the Civil War is kind of overly negative. New Jersey and Newark kind of gets this label of being a traitor city and a traitor state. I'm not so sure that I would push it that far. I think it's somewhere in between. There is opposition. But yeah, I mean, there's some prominent citizens around that South Park, so you can see that they would have some clout and put up some serious opposition.
Yes.
In spite of the fact that it stayed such a short time in the war, how did they decide to put the statue in Brooklyn?
I'll give you a very brief answer on that, but we'll explore it more on Tuesday night. But the statue of the seated Lincoln statue in Newark was paid for by a man named Amos Van Horn, who he's actually a native of Warren County, and the family moved here in the 1850s. Later started a furniture business here, furniture repair business, which he then turned into a secondhand furniture store when the repair business kind of fell off in the years leading up to the war. Van Horn left Newark in 1861 to join the Union forces and fought in the Civil War for 2 years. A combat veteran, commended for his gallantry, came back to Newark in 1863, resumed his furniture business, retail business, and added home furnishings to it as well, and became one of the most prominent citizens of that era in Newark. Right after the turn of the 20th century, he ceded control of his business to a larger firm, but he stayed on as a director and a vice president. And I believe it's 1908 that his wife dies. Now, they have no children. And Van Horn decides that he starts thinking about his legacy. And he starts giving away his money, and it's considerable. And most of it's given away anonymously, and an awful lot of it is given to his former Civil War comrades. He dies in 1909 himself, and in his will, he leaves $25,000 for the Lincoln statue. He also leaves $25,000 for the statue in Washington Park, and he leaves $100,000 for the Wars of America statue in Military Park. In my research in the statue, I came away feeling very sad that there's not more recognition of Amos Van Horn here in Newark, because he was one of our great citizens, and it was the money that he left in his estate, his feeling for Lincoln, that that led to the installation of that statue in front of the county courthouse.
Where you show how Lincoln got a positive reception in Newark, even though politically the city didn't support him that much. And I'm wondering if this sheds light on attitudes that you would have to draw on during the war years, in which people supported a union and a kind of American nationalism that didn't extend to emancipation, didn't extend to transforming the social system so much as preserving a union above all else.
Yeah, as I said in the response to the first question, I believe that Newark might be a little fickle, right? It's a shift to give him a good reception, and then post-Sumter, definitely behind the Union cause. The troops muster after volunteering at Military Park like they had done in all the previous wars. So there's a tradition of supporting the Union and Newark doing its part. And then, as the fortunes of the war and Lincoln ebb and flow, there's some back and forth in the newspapers and among citizens. Leading up to, some complications in 1863. I didn't go as far as 1865. As a close look. I would love to see what happens. There are many eulogies given at the various churches in support of him, 20, 30, 40-page eulogies that most Newarkers, Protestant Newarkers, would have heard.
In a way, the least dependable sources of information about this kind of attitude is parades and eulogies, in a way. Look at votes. Votes is where people manifest their beliefs. Look at debates in state legislatures. And no northern state is united in support of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, the closest is probably Massachusetts. In Illinois, they have a convention in the state capitol while Lincoln's in residence there with his temporary office, warning that if Lincoln coerces the South, there'll be blood in the streets. In Chicago, in New York. This is a very divided country. It's not just divided north and south. And I think Tom is right and you're right, that union is and nationalism is a more unifying factor and a more unifying rallying cry than liberation. And Lincoln and the Union luck out in a way when the American flag is desecrated in Charleston. It's shot down twice, and then it's dragged through the mud of the streets of Charleston and then returned, muddied and splattered, to Colonel Anderson, who brings it here to New York, to the media center of the country. And they display it. They put it on the Statue of Washington in Union Square. They unfurl it on Broadway when the 7th Regiment marches downtown. So the assault on nationalism is definitely a more unifying theme. The big test comes later, and Lincoln changing the rationale for the war to not just the Union as it was, but as the Union as it could be is the test. None of us did perfectly, but we all, in the end, we did pretty well.
I just want to thank both of you for some splendid talks and handling the questions so well. Perhaps the conversation can continue. Again, if you want to be on our mailing list for future programs, there are some forms to fill out at the table there. Give them to me. Thank you for coming. Good night.